Look, you may not be aware of it, but there's a war going on in America, and it's a war for the soul of our history. And at this point, you've got to take a side. This is a war against the neo Confederates, white supremacists, and other groups that try and glorify and promote the Confederacy and Confederate worship. If you're new to my channel, my name is Professor G. I'm a law professor, and my area of scholarly research is in antebellum slave laws and slave codes, the laws and codes that created and sustained and maintained the system of the slaveocracy that was the antebellum South and would eventually become the 11 slaveholding states that made the Confederate States of America. And one of the things that I do is every day I go onto Google News, and I type in Robert E. Lee or I type in Confederacy, and I see what comes up, because there is a war. And it is truly the war for the soul of American history. And you're either going to side with those who choose to ignore the fact that the antebellum slaveholding states was a slave society, not a society with slaves, that the system of African slavery was based on white supremacy, pseudoscience, and everything else that I've talked about in previous videos. You should go and watch some of those again if you're new. And you're going to allow these people, if you don't stand up against them, to promote a extinct nation, the Confederacy, that was created for one purpose and one purpose alone: to continue and to perpetuate and maintain forever white supremacy and the system of African slavery. And when I Googled Robert E. Lee yesterday, I came up with this article about Robert E. Lee Memorial to go back up at a school in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, we're not going to talk about Robert E. Lee in this video. I talked about him in another video. Go watch it, video titled Robert E. Lee is a Monster, because it's not even an argument the man was. Man was a brutal enslaver, and he should never be worshipped as he is today. But what I want to show you is, if you look at this monument here, the top of the monument, even though it's a little small thing, is the seal of the Confederate States of America. And that right there is enough that any red-blooded American who truly understands our history, if you don't get mad about that, then you really have an anger problem, because your anger is directed at the wrong things. That seal was the great seal of a country that again existed for one purpose: to forever maintain and to perpetuate the system of African slavery based on white supremacy. So just for a brief snippet today, even though it really isn't the focus of this channel, I really want to focus on these cases that show you how brutal the system of slavery actually was towards Africans and people of African descent. But let's look at the Confederacy. So any monument that you see that has a Confederate seal, you should object to, and object to immediately. And all of these movements to put these Confederate monuments back in place, they need to be objected to. And we need to stand up against that, because it is now clear that the neo-Confederates, neo-Nazis, that entire wing of the right now feels comfortable enough to come out in the open and challenge and attack anyone who really holds to the truth of what the Confederacy and the slave-holding antebellum South actually was. So I'm just going to give you a snippet real quick. Let's look at just 3 states' secession ordinances that talk about why they left, why they decided to leave the Union and form the Confederacy. Mississippi. We'll start with Mississippi. Now, I'm here in Louisiana. I will talk about Louisiana in a second. But with this, Mississippi said, quote, in their secession ordinance, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world." Doesn't get any more clearer than that. Alabama, in their secession ordinance, "Whereas the election of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin to the offices of President and Vice President of the United States of America by a sectional party avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions," and it goes on. I just snipped that because the domestic institution is referring to slavery. What Alabama was mad about is that Lincoln and Hamlin were elected, and they were, of course, seen as being in opposition to the domestic institution of slavery. There was something called the federal question. It was known before then that the federal government, unfortunately, was limited by the Constitution and had no rights to prevent a state from either having or abolishing slavery. And anytime any issue was brought up to the federal government that said this is the federal question doctrine, it is not something we're able to do. So it was always shot down. It was a domestic affair of the state. But Alabama believed that Lincoln was going to come to office and usurp the power of the federal government in order to abolish slavery in the states, even though Lincoln, we'll talk about Lincoln later, was fully on board with allowing slavery to continue if it kept the Union together. He wasn't really a hero, but again, we can talk about that later. But Alabama clearly says they're leaving because this new federal government is hostile to our domestic institution, by which they meant slavery. Now let's look at Texas. Quote, in all the non-slaveholding states, in violation of that good faith and comity which should exist between entirely distinct nations, meaning states here, the people have formed themselves into a great sectional party. Here we go again. And now strong enough in numbers to control the affairs of each of those states, based upon an unnatural feeling of hostility to these southern states and their beneficent and patriarchal system of African slavery, proclaiming the debased doctrine of equality of all men. So Texas is saying, we're angry because this now sectional party, the Republican Party, is saying, oh, all men are equal. Well, to us Texans, we know that's unnatural, right? It says, irrespective of race and color, a doctrine at war with nature. So for Texas, the equality of races was at war with the natural order of things. In opposition to the experience of mankind and in violation of the plainest revelations of divine law. So they're saying clearly nature shows us that whites are superior to blacks, and even the Bible, God tells us that whites are superior to blacks. They demand the abolition of Negro slavery throughout the Confederacy, the recognition of political equality between the white and Negro races, and avow their determination to press on their crusade against us so long as a Negro slave remains in these states. So Texas was saying, look, you're not taking our slavery away. It's the natural order of things. It's what God wants. And because you're going to try to do that, we're going to leave, right? Now, even forgetting all of that, let's look at the Confederate Constitution. Because the Confederate Constitution did something that the U.S. Constitution didn't. The U.S. Constitution the framers of the Constitution had to battle between those who wanted slavery and those who wanted slavery to be abolished. And one of the things that they really couldn't come to terms with was to use the term slave in the U.S. Constitution, right? It says persons. It doesn't say slaves. So persons in bondage and terminology like that. The Confederate Constitution said, fudge that, we are openly showing the world that we exist for one purpose and one purpose alone, to preserve and maintain the institution of African slavery. So the Confederate Constitution states slavery by name. Article 1, Section 9 says, no bill of attainder ex post facto law or law denying or impairing the right of property in Negro slaves shall be passed. Not Asian slaves, not Caucasian slaves, Negro slaves, African slaves. There shall be no law passed by the Confederate government, the federal government, impairing the right of property in Negro slaves. Now, there's arguments over whether or not a state could have abolished slavery, but that obviously never got there because this country existed for, 4 years, right? Someone made a video a couple of years ago saying the annoying orange has existed longer than the Confederacy, but we still worship this slaveholding, crazy nonsense of a failed country. But it goes on, Article 4, Section 2, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all the privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states, and shall have the right of transit and sojourn in any state of this Confederacy with their slaves and other property, and the right of property in said slaves shall not be thereby impaired. So, if another state, in theory, did abolish slavery, and you wanted to travel through that state or into that state with your slaves, they could not impair your right to continue to own other human beings, specifically Africans and people of African descent. So if that's not enough, let's look at this unhinged fellow. I mean, this dude looks out of his mind. This is Alexander Stephens. And the funny thing is, I forget the actor's name. I'll put up a picture when I remember it. But the actor who portrayed him in Lincoln looks just like him, like as unhinged as you could imagine. So, I mean, this guy is just crazy. And when you look at someone like that, if you elect that person to office, you get what you deserve, right? But Alexander Stephens gave the cornerstone speech. And it was called the cornerstone speech because what he was saying is, what I'm about to tell you is the cornerstone, the foundation of this Confederacy, of this new government. And here are just some, one-line zingers from this speech. He said, quote, African slavery as it exists among us is the proper status of the Negro in our form of civilization, end quote. So right there, right? Africans are supposed to be slaves. But now he goes on to talk about how the original Constitution was battling between equality and how they got equality of the races wrong. And then he goes on to say, quote, our new government is founded upon the exactly the opposite idea. So he's saying it's not about equality between races. He goes on, quote, its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. That slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, Our new government is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. So if you needed any more proof, then you're just being hard-headed. When you look at that great seal of the Confederacy, you are looking at an icon, an image that represents a country that existed solely for one purpose: to maintain in perpetuity forever the institution of African slavery and white supremacy in a nation state. And the fact that there are people still to this day trying to glorify it, and we can argue, about different types of monuments and things or whatever you want to discuss, but your people who support this are flat out wrong. The Confederacy was a slaveocracy. It was run based on white supremacy, and they've left us plenty of information to prove that. So when you see monuments like this going up or going back up, you cannot be passive in the war over the soul of American history anymore. We're either going to acknowledge the horrors of the slaveocracy, of the white supremacy that was the foundation of the antebellum South and the Confederacy, and we're going to come to terms and acknowledge the horrors of our past and how that affects us today, or we're going to whitewash it, cover it up, and say, no, the South was just sweet tea sipping, porch sitting, gone with the wind, hoop skirts, and it was a great time. Let's make America great again, right? So that's what we're fighting, and no one can be passive in this. So I hope you enjoyed. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and I will see you for the next video lesson.